Hi, Doctrines 2. This is me, Randy Everest, just recording a video for you. I want to take a few minutes and just kind of give a talk about stuff that's in your Erickson reading. Now, I've got it with me here, as long as my Oregon Ducks t-shirt is showing, all right. But no, seriously, I have my Erickson reading here, and I want to be able to help you work through some of the issues. One of the major, I don't know about complaints, but one of the major issues is that we have with Doctrines 1 and 2 online is that the readings can be very complex. And so we just want to break it down for you. Now, in one video, I'm not going to be able to go through every single chapter, every single point. I'm rather going to take 2 or 3 points and just kind of break it down for you, maybe hopefully give you a better understanding. Of course, you're always welcome to contact me. You've got my email address and even my phone number there on the course page in Populi, so be sure to look at that. But the first thing I want to cover, it should be found in chapter 31, and you can actually see the first question we're going to be working on if you look at the Points to Ponder resource. That question is, to what is it quite possible that Jesus was alluding by saying, before Abraham was, I am? So what they're asking is, what Dr. Christmas is asking is, what was Jesus probably talking about by saying, before Abraham was, I am? What does Erickson say about that? Well, possibly Jesus is referring to the I am formula of Exodus 3, verse 14. And the context of that is Moses is saying, look, I know you want to send me, God, to talk to Pharaoh, but who shall I say sent me? Because I don't understand. They're going to wonder what God sent you. Is it one of the Egyptian gods? Is it just an unknown God? Who is it? Give me his name so I've got some credibility and I know who to rally the people under, basically. As he just wanted instruction. And God says to him, Yahweh says to him, I am that I am. And it's amazing because it basically, theologically interpreted, it means he's the self-existent one. There is no one that's responsible for God's existence. That's what that significance of I am is. And Jesus, although his words are recorded in Greek for us in the Gospels, nonetheless, what Jesus said was ego eimi, which is just the Greek words for I am. But what he says is, before Abraham existed, before Abraham was born, before Abraham was around, not I was, not, as the Jehovah's Witnesses would say, not I have been, but instead, I am. Uh, that's pretty awesome. No one can claim that. No mere human can claim that. Now, while Jesus was fully human, he was not merely human. And that's going to be a point to remember as well. So I want to see this here, check it out from John 8. The context of John 8 is pretty neat. You got the discussion, the pericope of the woman, and everything like that, and Jews eventually believe on him. But the whole discourse is actually after the woman is her life is spared and she's forgiven. The whole discourse is the group of the Jews, which is really a way that John uses to describe the unbelieving ones. In fact, he contrasts this later by saying Jews who believe on him. But when he's talking about they, in the back and forth in the discourse, like in verse 33, they answered him. That's talking about the unbelieving Jews and the Pharisees. Well, there's kind of this fight that they're having, and they're saying to Jesus, they're like, hey, we're of Abraham's seed, so we don't know what you're talking about. And Jesus was like, well, if you really were of Abraham's seed, you would honor me because I honor the Father. And you're not honoring the Father. I'm of my Father who is God, and you're of your father who's the devil, Jesus says in verse 44, which is pretty strong language. You're of your father the devil. Imagine saying that today and seeing how well that would go over with some people. So don't really do that, I think, unless you really feel God's leading you. Might not be the best thing for you to do, but it was Jesus doing it, so it's okay. What's interesting is they even take a jab at Jesus in verse 41. You do the deeds of your father, that's what Jesus said. Then said they to him, We be not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. And so they're taking a jab at Jesus' virgin birth, his virgin conception. Well, they didn't buy that, so they figured, hey, he's born of fornication, maybe even a Samaritan. They just wanted to keep that on the hush hush down low. And Jesus, kind of brushes that aside. He's saying, I'm honoring my Father. And what's cool is in verse 56, he said, Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Now, what is Jesus talking about? Well, if you look back in verse 51, Jesus said, If a man keep my saying, he shall never see death. And that's what sets this whole thing up. If a man keeps my saying, he will never see death. And they virtually bust out laughing at him. And they say, Are you serious, Jesus? Abraham was awesome and he's dead. And the prophets were awesome and they're dead. So are you telling me that these guys weren't very good and that you're way better than they are? They're all dead. The prophets who followed Abraham are dead. What's the deal here? And Jesus, I think he's saying in verse 56, You think he's dead, but he lives on. He rejoiced to see my day, this time, the time of the Messiah, and he was glad. And I think that speaks to Abraham living on. Why? Because if a man keeps the saying of Jesus, he's actually keeping the saying of God the Father. And so Abraham also believed in a resurrection of sorts. You can see that back in Genesis, when Genesis 22, when Abraham has to take Isaac to sacrifice him, he says to the servants who are keeping the cattle and all that, he says, Hey, I and the lad will go and we'll, hang out and do a sacrifice and we will be back. So we'll be back, I and the lad, and that's revealed again in Hebrews. So there's a ton of material back here to talk about this whole background. And that's when he says in verse 58, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. The whole context couldn't be any clearer. Jesus, in the whole chapter, is going on and on, identifying himself with God and the message of God. And finally, he flat out says it. You want to talk about, pre-existence. It's not just that I pre-existed, I have been. I'm identifying myself with the God of the Old Testament. Jesus is making a claim to be God. And that's something that we really have to keep in mind. With our Christology, in chapter 32, another question listed on the Points to Ponder resource is this. In what case did Jesus expressly declare that he did not know a particular matter? That might shock some of you before reading this material. You might think that, well, Jesus was omniscient, so even as a man, he just knew everything, so there's no big deal, right? Well, this is where it gets some controversy, some Bible reading, and some fun all in one. But there is a case in which Jesus very explicitly and specifically said he did not know it, and that was the second coming. He said, At the time of the second coming, no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. That's Erickson here writing on Mark 13:32. That's actually Mark 13:32. So that's a reference if you want to find that. But hey, the Son says of himself, the Son does not know when the second coming is. So we have to, any part of our Christology has to take into account that Jesus' knowledge was limited. Let's look at Luke chapter 2, and verses 41 through 51 is the story about where 12-year-old Jesus gets left in Jerusalem when the whole caravan with his family had gone to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Then they left to go back home, but they forgot Jesus, which actually isn't nearly as terrible as it sounds because there was a giant caravan. He was 12 years old, not a little baby, just different cultural things were involved. So he must have had a lot of freedom, though, because they didn't notice immediately. But the good thing is he was there, and he said, I must be about my Father's business. Now, in verses 40 and 52, we have some bookends for this story. And verse 40 says, And the child grew, and waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. So that seems like an interesting statement about Jesus' growth, both physically and spiritually. He waxed, that is, gained or grew strong in spirit. Now look at verse 52. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. But that implies necessarily that he had less wisdom, less stature, less favor with God and man. It doesn't mean he It doesn't imply that he was sinful or did things wrong or things like that at all. It just means that those things increased. They got those good things increased. They have more and more. So how do we answer that? Those verses indicate that Jesus limited himself during his incarnation. So if you cross-reference this with Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, that great Christological hymn, which was probably sung by the early church. We have no way of knowing what it sounded like, but those were the words. And you look at that and you see, well, what does that mean? It looks like Jesus gave up the independent use of his divine attributes. What does that mean? That means that while he was on this earth, he didn't lose his divine attributes. There's a branch that you read about called kenotic Christology, or that you will read about this week. And kenotic Christology says that Jesus actually no longer had the divine attributes while he was on earth. And that's not right. There's some good theological reasons to think that's not right. For one, Jesus was claiming to be God while he was on this earth, and if you don't have the attributes of God, then you aren't God. And then there's some good philosophical reasons to think that there's no possible way that what it takes to be God can be given up by God. Otherwise, he wouldn't be who he was. He'd be somebody else. So since Jesus is God, can't really give him up. But he did give up the independent exercise. That's what it means when it says he humbled himself, came in the form of a servant. So when he came here, he said, I'm not going to claim these rights. And you can see that throughout the scripture. He could have called angels to come and fight for him. And he said, hey, if I wanted a kingdom of this world, I'd call my followers to fight. I'd call my angels to fight. He had all these prerogatives, divine prerogatives, and yet he was not taking advantage of them. He was actually saying, no, I'm going to come as a servant. And it seems as though he did these things in the power of the Holy Spirit. So what implications does this have for us? What about sinlessness and temptation? You're going to be going on your week number 2 discussion forum where you have to talk about, well, could Jesus have sinned or could he not have sinned? Well, what about Jesus' knowledge? Millard Erickson says that for him, he solves the problem by saying there were some things that Jesus did not know, but that he refrained from making claims about them, so he did not err. So for Millard Erickson, you could say, well, did Jesus know about, advanced, algebra, or did Jesus know about the calculus as invented by Leibniz or Newton? Well, the answer is no, he didn't know that in his incarnation, but he also wouldn't have been in a position to talk about calculus and things of that nature. So he would have avoided making claims or committing himself one way or the other on things like that. So I can appreciate that. I think there might be some interesting issues that come up on that. For instance, did he ever believe that he was not the Messiah? That's tough to say. I mean, that might make he might be able to avoid that. Erickson might be able to avoid that commitment. But if he by the time he was 12, it looks like he probably did know he was the Messiah. But what about when he was 7 or 6 and he was learning about the Messiah coming? And did he ever think, I am not the Messiah? Well, that's a tough question. But we also have to wonder if he ever thought something that wasn't true. I mean, it seems like Erickson's defense about doctrinal matters, theological matters, I think that's pretty easy to apply. But like Erickson's view would have the consequence that Jesus never thought his mom was in the kitchen when she wasn't. Or, Jesus never thought someone was, that Joseph was going to come back at 8 o'clock at night, but he came back at 9 o'clock at night. That seems a little odd to me. But I mean, it's possible. It's still possible. It just seems less natural if Jesus gave up all of the independent use of his divine attributes. How do we solve that? Well, we can't be sure. That's going to be the major issue. We can't be 100% sure of how that's going to go down, or what that's going to look like. Erickson's view is technically possible. I don't know how plausible it is. And let me make a distinction. There seems to be a qualitative difference in saying that Jesus may have guessed that his childhood friend was coming over in an hour, but didn't come over that day. There may be a qualitative difference between that and Jesus saying, "I am not the Messiah." I think there's a definite difference. We want to say one's almost inconsequential, one's a big deal. I don't like though saying that there was a possible scenario in which Jesus is wrong. Another thing to consider, though, is that we don't want to read our 21st century mindset back into the first century. What do I mean by that? Well, take an example I gave you just a minute ago about Jesus thought Joseph would come back at 8 o'clock and Joseph came back at 9 o'clock. Very plausibly, no one would have thought that was a mistake in the first century. Why? Because technical precision is not on people's minds. Here in America, we are very concerned about being on time. And if you're more than 15 minutes late in America, we tend to look at you like, why are you wasting my time? Well, even today, going to any of the two-thirds majority world, you go anywhere there and being a half hour late, it's no big deal. Nobody really even blinks. In fact, it's expected virtually in many, many, many places in the world, and it's not considered a waste of time. Well, that attitude was pretty common in the first century. Would not have Jesus thought, oh yeah, he'll be back in just a few hours. Well, Jesus says he'll be back in 3 hours, he's back in 4, and our 21st century mindset says, boom, Jesus would have been wrong. No, that's just not the way it works. He wasn't intending to give a precise definition. And you know what's funny is, we aren't really intending to give a precise definition either. And you say, Randy, what do you mean? I'll tell you. If I say I'm going to record this at 8 o'clock at night and I recorded at 8:01, scandalous. I didn't get a precision time in there, did I? So I guess I'm wrong and I lied to everyone. No, we take it for granted. It's understood to be an approximate time or even anywhere within that hour. Same thing with them. They would have understood it to be an approximate time or anything within that time frame or that day or whatever. So I'm going to get to the last thing, and that is, what implications does Jesus' knowledge and his growing and increasing in wisdom, what does that have? What implications does that have for his sinlessness and his ability to be tempted? Many of you are going to want to say, and a lot of people do say, that Jesus must have been able to sin because he had a real temptation according to the Bible, and the ability to sin is necessary in order to be tempted. But that's not really true. You don't have to have the ability to do something in order to be tempted to do something. So let's say that there's a chocolate cake, and I really enjoyed having a slice of it for dinner, and it's put in the refrigerator, and my wife says, "Don't have any more chocolate cake. You have one slice. That's good enough. Come back and get it another time." And I go to bed early because I just can't stand the temptation. And you know what? I lay in my bed and I thrash all night and I think, I really want to get another slice. And I'm tempted, and you know what? I finally overcome. And after hours of sleeplessness and tossing and turning and fighting the temptation, I close it off and I'm able to go to sleep, and I wake up having successfully resisted the temptation all throughout the night to get a slice of chocolate cake. The temptation was real and I really overcame it. But then I go to the refrigerator, I open the door, and the chocolate cake is gone. And I say, "What happened?" And my wife says, "Oh, after you went to bed, we had some company over and they ate the cake within about an hour." Well, guess what? Let's say I had succumbed to the temptation, and at 3 o'clock in the morning I said, "I'm going to have a slice." It wouldn't have been possible for me to get a slice, would it? Because it was gone. So, you can be genuinely tempted, even though it's not really possible for you to fulfill that temptation. And that's something I want you to think about. If the only reason to think Jesus could have sinned is because the ability to sin is entailed by really being tempted, well, we can remove that and say that's not really the case at all. And if he's limited in knowledge, all that's required is while he's being tempted, what's occurring to him, or what we call an occasional belief, what's occurring to him right at the moment is that he could partake. Even if he couldn't partake in sin, he could partake in the individual act. Like Jesus could have, used his divine attributes to change the stone into bread. That's not impossible. But what's impossible is to place his own wants and needs ahead of God, what basically not submitting to the Spirit. That's what's impossible. So there's a sense in which the individual act is possible, but the sin behind the act is not possible. And that's where I would take it, that Jesus could not have sinned, but I'm interested to see what you all say. So if you have any questions, um, don't hesitate to ask me. There's still a lot of unsolved issues in Christology, and I'd really like to hopefully frame the issues for you and just kind of assist you in your reading of Millard Erickson and the Bible. So have a good week.